Welcome to The Right Approach. We're your hosts. I'm JW Judge.
And I'm Barbara Hinske. This is a podcast for writers to explore more about to learn more about the craft of writing, and we explore a new topic every week. So let's get started.
All right, let's start with personal updates for today. What have you been working on? As this airs, it will have been 2 weeks since we last talked about this, but as we're recording, it's only been a few days. So it may just be what you did over the weekend.
Well, over the weekend, I wrote a whole lot. I'm now almost a third of the way through the fourth book in the Emily series. And for the first time yesterday afternoon, I lost about 2 hours worth of writing. I've not done that before. I'm really good paranoid about saving things. And I Googled all over and clipboard and this and that. I think I know what happened. But anyhow, it was a Sunday. I had plans to go down and make a nice dinner and all that. And I was cursing away, and my husband said, "What's going on?" And I told him, and I said, "So dinner is whatever you fix." And he's like, "Okay, I'll get on the phone and make dinner." And I'm proud of myself because I put my head back down and wrote that scene because I've been really happy with it. And I thought, oh man, I wanted that. So that was my day.
So
Yeah,
what program do you write in?
Here's my process now. I write in Scrivener, and then I copy each scene and put it in a Word document that I call whatever the name of the title is for Pro Writing Aid. I then run it through Pro Writing Aid in smaller chunks, because if you do a big document, it takes forever. Once it's been through Pro Writing Aid, I put it in another document that then I send to my editor, and I work with my editor writing coach every week now. So it's kind of a multi-step process. I also copy my outline from Scrivener and paste it into Plotter, which I've been using, so that I can export that into a Word document. And the export function isn't working very well, and I'm getting cranky with Plotter. So I do a lot of that stuff.
So what did you lose it in Scrivener?
Yes.
Yeah. So Scrivener has worked flawlessly for me for, I don't know, as long as I've been using it, for 5 or 6 years now. And except during my writing of my third book, I discovered that I erased a chapter. Like, I went to that section. I guess I do them in folders within Scrivener and have a text under the folder. And
I do.
Okay. And so one of my chapter sections, I went into it and it was empty, just gone. And I don't export it or anything except for in like the big chunks, but I don't do it daily. So I was able to, after I quit freaking out, I went and Googled how to obtain my most recent backup. And so I checked the most recent backup and it wasn't in that one. And then I checked the one before that and it was there. And so I was able to recover it, but my goodness, the panic that's involved is so I don't know how you got yourself back together in order to write it all over again, because I don't think I could have done that in the moment.
Well, I was so flipping mad, and it was warm where I was sitting and all that, but I just thought, no, just buckle up, Buttercup, and write it. But that whole thing where you look at the bottom of the Scrivener and it says 0 words, I'm like, wait a minute, no, I had 1,200 words. No. And I went to the backup stuff. I must not have we probably shouldn't belabor this, but my backup was a week old in Scrivener, and I thought it was, I save everything, but that's different than backup. So I probably need to go into settings. I mean, I love Scrivener, but it is such a complex piece of software that getting it joggled to your preferences is tough. I do like my thing of just, after I finish a section, Control A, Control C, boom, put it somewhere else. At least then I'll have it.
All right, I didn't know this about you until now, but I always feel like when somebody uses keyboard shortcuts like that, they are a kindred spirit
Oh,
because I
good.
use keyboard shortcuts all
Yeah.
the time. But we're getting super nerdy here.
Yes.
Um, as for what I did, and maybe there are people who will appreciate that and maybe not. Um, this weekend, I wrote about 900 words. I am on the weekends right now. We're updating our house. So the house that we live in was built about 45 years ago. Some of the things are original to that. And so, like, there was chair rail all on every floor. On the bottom floor, there is chair rail. And so, over the last month, I've been taking the chair rail off, which is the easiest part, and then I have to joint compound and sand and joint
Mhm.
compound and sand. And then once you finally think it looks good, then you can paint.
Yeah.
And only after you paint do you discover if it really looks good or not. And so that's what I did over the weekend. Was do that in our living room. So that was an undertaking. My two
Sure.
kids wanted to help with sanding, and so I left them to some degree. Um, and especially the 8-year-old, he did a good job. Or I guess he's not 8 yet; he's 7, but he did good. I was actually impressed, and so that's what I did. And hopefully we'll get back on the writing train soon. But we are here today to talk about the role of research in writing. And it's particularly fiction writing, because fiction writing research and nonfiction writing research are usually two very different things. And I love researching. And um, I try not to get too involved in research. And so, uh, so I'm going to let you go first, because if I don't, then I may just take up like the whole half hour talking about this, and you might not get a word in edgewise. So, tell me about research, because I am sure that particularly we talked about the Guiding Emily series a couple of times now. I don't know whether how much you research for your others, but I'm sure that there was research involved in writing that one.
Yes, there certainly was. And I'm the polar opposite on the research stuff. I hate research. Hate it. And I dread it. And I do just the minimum I have to do, except for Guiding Emily, because I was writing about guide dogs in training, and about newly blind people. And that I had to get right. I was committed because of my conversations with people at the Foundation for Blind Children, which services a large adult population. I knew the dissatisfaction that the visually impaired community feels with how blind people are portrayed in the media and in fiction. And I didn't want to victimize people at all. So the Foundation for Blind Children, and I'm giving half my proceeds from Guiding Emily to them, was it's just extraordinarily kind to me. In facilitating research, I talked to counselors. I sat in on counseling sessions, group counseling sessions with the newly blind, where people talked about their despair and depression. And the foundation had to get releases from all these people for me to sit and listen to them. One woman went in for an emergency C-section, lost her baby, and came out blind.
Wow.
Okay, that's a lot to voice and a lot to let a stranger voice and feel safe with. The foundation gave me white cane training, which was very cool. I was able to network my way into 3 days behind the scenes at Guide Dogs for the Blind at their big campus in San Rafael, California. So I got to see all of that and talk to their higher ups, and I attended puppy raising like workshops and all kinds of stuff. That was so fun and so hands-on. And now I'm writing this fourth book in the series, and I have some romantic scenes taking place in Golden Gate Park in the redwood forest, because I figured that would
Mm-hmm.
be a good place for this blind woman to feel the change in climate and listen to the birds and all that. I've been in the park once, decades ago. Um, I think this would be a good reason to go back and write off my trip. But nonetheless, Google, Google and YouTube was my friend on all of that research.
Well, and if there's anywhere that's a good place for talking about feeling the change in a microclimate, it's San Francisco.
Yeah.
Because I've only been once, but and it was in July, but San Francisco itself was so cold.
Oh
But
yeah.
then
Yeah.
when you went across, it was 90 degrees all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was amazing. I couldn't believe the change there. Because this is, I'm jumping in on you here, but there's
No.
this, I used to, before I was married and had kids, ride a motorcycle, and I loved it. Um, but then, like life changes. And so I lived downtown Birmingham, but when I was dating the person who's now my wife, she lived about 10 miles north of Birmingham. And Birmingham is a very it's called Tree City, USA. I mean, it's one of it, like the monikers that they attach to it, because it's a very, there's a lot of trees in Birmingham. But
Oh,
then, like, once you
jealous.
get to the suburbs north of Birmingham, like it's basically woods with some small town or small cities, big towns in them. And as you leave Birmingham, you go through North Birmingham, and then there's some woods, and you can feel a temperature drop at night. You can't feel it as much during the day, but when you're on a motorcycle, you can feel this. It's like this barrier almost of a temperature drop of somewhere between 5 and 10 degrees. It feels like
Wow.
every time. And it's just one
Wow.
of those feelings that I remember on my motorcycle that if you weren't transporting that way, you would never notice that. So I thought that was really interesting what you said about her feeling that climate difference.
Mhm. I certainly try and put myself into thinking about how I would perceive my world in another sense. So that's Emily. Then my other big research series was Final Circuit, one of my thrillers, where I did a lot of research into crematoriums. And that was fascinating. Like, I don't know if you know this, but crematoriums have to operate in daylight hours. And there are inspectors that go around, and you can see from the smoke if they're operating after dark. So crematoriums all have apps now that tell them when sunrise and sunset is, and hook the ovens to it and all that kind of stuff. I did learn in writing mysteries or thrillers, you really have to be accurate on your details, because those readers are the crossword puzzle, New York Times any crossword puzzle people, and they will call you out if you've got something happening on the wrong corner. If you write about a city, you talk about it the northeast corner in New York, and no, it's the northwest corner. They will burn you to the ground for that. So that's kind of what I've learned. But you love research, so let's get some of that enthusiasm from you.
All right. So it has taken, depending on the book that I've been writing, it has taken so many different forms. So for the first book that I attempted, the first novel that I attempted to write, and which I think we probably talked about it early on, that it was based on some events in my family history. And ultimately, I decided I didn't know enough to write that story at that time. And so I set it aside, and I haven't picked it back up yet, though I
Mhm.
fully intend to. But it really catalyzed when I found some war letters and family notes about the adventures of my, hang on, I have to think about it, great, great, great grandfather who immigrated to the United States from Germany in 1857. And
Mhm.
apparently he came over when he was a teenager. He ran away from home in Germany because like he stole something from the church and got in trouble and just bailed. And um, so he came over, he became a whaler and then was involved in a shipwreck. And
Wow.
He fought in the Civil War, and there's some documents that indicate he might have fought for first the Confederacy and then abandoned his post there and went and enlisted in New York. And then after that was over, he decided to go west and seek his fortunes like so many other people. And one of the people who went with him robbed him, and he was left with nothing and eventually settled down in Texas. And so,
Wow.
all of that. And he wrote letters back to Germany, which somebody along the way translated some of those into English, but not all of them. And so I still have these letters that are in German that I have no idea what they say. And the handwriting is a little, it's not bad, but it's difficult to translate into English when I don't even know the language,
Yeah.
to even like type it into Google Translated, figure out what he's saying is tough. And so that's him, and that catalyzed an idea for a story, attaching that to in 1940, my great grandfather killed his estranged wife and himself in a small town in West Texas, which was a part of my family history that I didn't know until less than 10 years ago because
Mm.
nobody talked about it. It's just like there's this one part of the family that doesn't exist, basically. And it's just this black hole. It's just never mentioned. And so I don't even remember now how I found out about it. But after I found out that this had happened, I did some research going and looking at newspaper archives and found the newspaper article about this event, about the murder suicide. And it kind of reads like a police report. And it was, you know, I don't know these people, their family, but like I don't know them. And so it was just really interesting to be able to read it detached, but knowing that, this is my grandfather who I did know my entire life.
Mhm.
His father had done this, and it was just somebody that was never mentioned. Um, so in 1940, the country is still in the Great Depression. Work is hard to come by, especially for a lot of younger males who are aging into adulthood, and there's just not work for them to do. So the Roosevelt administration had created the Works Progress Administration, who undertook a lot of public projects. And so one of the things they did was created the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was designed for young men, young adults, to come work at these CCC camps and build state and national parks and the infrastructure that would be involved with them. So in 1940, when my great grandfather is going through this turmoil that ends in a murder suicide, my grandfather has gone to Colorado, where he is at one of these CCC camps outside of Denver.
Yeah.
And he's working there building a state park. And I knew this part of his story, that he had worked at building state parks in Colorado, and or at least I'd known about Colorado, but he also worked in Arizona and Utah. Um, I didn't have any other information about it. So I did some research about how you can obtain these files because they're all archived. And so I obtained his personnel file from when he was at these CCC camps and got that sent to me and found the dates of where he was and when. And he was injured a couple of times and the projects that he worked on. And like this stuff is just out there if you search for it enough. And so I'm learning about my family history
Mhm.
through these official documents and through newspaper articles. And one of the things that I don't know because nobody ever talked about it is he's in Colorado when his father kills himself and my grandfather's stepmother. How it's 1940. How does he find out? that
Mhm.
happens, because at some point he finds out and comes back home. But I don't know if that's a telegram or a phone call or whatever. And
Mhm.
so, I want to write this story where I have some information, and there's a lot of information about the work that was done on these projects. And for the rest, I'm going to just have to make it up and fill in holes, but I want to make it as true to actual events as I can, knowing that it's still going to be novelized. And I just want
Mhm.
it to you know, feel real. Well, a couple of years ago, I guess it was 3 years ago now, in 2019, I was going to a conference in Denver. And as soon as I signed up for the conference, I looked at a map and figured out, okay, where is this camp in relation to Denver? And the first thing I did when my plane touched down, I rented a car and drove the hour west from the Denver airport, to into the mountains to go see this camp. And I just wanted to connect with this
Mhm.
part of my grandfather that I didn't know. And so I drive up the mountain and I go to this park, and there's not a lot there. It's just a few hiking trails and this one stone building that has a plaque that it was raised in 1940. Um, so I go, I just hike around this mountain, and there's a herd of buffalo or bison,
Oh,
not
wow.
buffalo,
That's
and they're behind a fence, because like you hear horror stories about people who decide they want to go see a buffalo and like try and touch it because
yeah.
they look kind of like cows, but they aren't cattle. Like
Yeah.
they are like, they're big and they're fast and they can run 30 miles an hour, and people get gored because they think like I'm just going to go try and touch a bison, and they are not
Wow.
even tempered cattle.
Yeah.
And so I'm seeing that, and then there's a storm coming from west to east, and you can just see it come in across the mountain range, and it's just a sheet of rain coming, and there's lightning. So that cut my hiking short because the lightning started coming right across the sky where I was.
Yeah.
But it was just really cool to, I'd been reading and researching about this, just to be
Mhm.
able to go and touch the places that he had touched 80 years earlier. And it was just a really cool experience to be able to do that. And
I'm amazed that his personnel records were still in existence. If he worked for a private company today, they would have been destroyed.
yeah,
What? That is fabulous.
yeah. And so, that was my real first experience with that. The first novel I completed was set in Birmingham, and it's fantasy. So aside from doing a little bit of research, making sure I get things exactly right, it was all places that I see every day for the most part.
Mhm.
And so there wasn't a lot of research for it. But the second novel, the sequel to that, so the first novel is Vulcan Rising. The second novel is called Seeking Sanctuary. And it's set 12 years later. And I knew it was going to be set in the Black Forest of Germany. But I didn't, before I started writing, I didn't have a particular village or town picked out.
Mhm.
But I knew that I didn't want it to be somewhere that's overly touristy, because I wanted it to be
Okay.
somewhere that doesn't have a lot of knowledge around it, like just common.
Yes.
So I
Why?
just looked on some maps and picked out this town called Hornburg, Germany. And it's in the Black Forest. It's kind of in that southwestern corner of Germany. And I started writing my story. But a few chapters in, I did not have an antagonist. And
Mhm.
so I hit a block because I needed one. And I start researching Hornburg, Germany and its history. And I discover that in 1960, there was a serial killer from Hornburg, Germany, that went on this just several week long rampage
Oh,
of
my
committing atrocities,
God.
um, that were all of his victims were women. And he killed 6 or 7 women and raped or attempted to rape and attempted to murder like 15 or 20 more
My
over the
God.
course of a couple of months before he was eventually caught and incarcerated and remained incarcerated for the rest of his life until he died. And it, through my research, I discovered like that happened in this town that I happened to choose.
Mhm.
And it played, as soon as I found that, it played such an integral role to what that story
Sure.
became because, it's dark fantasy
Yeah.
verging on horror. And I just built that into it because these characters went to this place of sanctuary, they thought. And
Mm.
it turns out this town has a terrible past that
Yeah.
comes into view. Um, but some difficulty that I had in writing that story was I have been to Germany, but I hadn't been to only once, and that was in 2004. And I hadn't been here to this town that I'm writing about. So my plan was I would just use Google Street View to really acquaint myself with this
Yeah.
town. Um, because you have to, like you said, you have to have all the details right. When you're writing these stories, people have to feel like they are present, and I need to make them present somewhere that I haven't been. And
Mhm.
so I attempted to do that and discovered that German privacy laws don't allow for Google Street View. You can get it in most of the countries in Europe, but not Germany. Like if you go to the
Oh.
Google Street View maps and zoom out, Germany is like this black hole. And
Oh.
so I'd already started writing the story and I was invested in this town and its history. And I ended up having to use virtual tours. I had to use YouTube. I used Google Maps and Google Earth. And just, I had to cobble this thing together. And I used image searches from this town and from the surrounding areas so that I could get as acquainted as I could with a place that
Yeah.
I hadn't been to and couldn't virtually walk around in either. And I think it ended
Mhm.
up being really effective. I mean, I think, I hope people who have read it and I've gotten, feedback from have
Mhm.
not commented, in a way that caused me to think that they didn't, couldn't place themselves there or see it. So, but I had to really change my strategy there and come at it in a much different way that I had anticipated when I started.
That that is so interesting. And I know talking with my other author friends, um, it's nice to think, oh, I'm going to write about France. And I've always teased I'm going to write a murder mystery set in the George Sank so that I can write off my time there. But okay, that's a nice idea, but it doesn't kind of work out. We all have to rely on what we can get our hands on. And wow, what a lot of work. I was reminded I do have one very fun research story for you.
Well,
I
let's hear this and then that'll bring us to the end. So let's tell
Okay,
this because I'm
this
glad to
is
end on a fun, good story here.
okay, this is easy. I write a series about a young woman who's opened her dream of a patisserie, a French bakery. And I'm thinking, I really don't know. I mean, I cook, I bake, but I don't really know anything about the bakery business. And my husband and I were headed out to go see a movie, and we park, and I look up and it says JL Patisserie right in front of me at this little strip center. So I go home and Google, and this woman, this charming young French woman, same age as my protagonist. She's actually Belgian, but she went to the Cordon Bleu. Anyway, she offers baking classes. So I signed my husband and he was a good sport and went with, and turns out he loved all of that stuff. So we did macaroons and eclairs and croissants and all kinds of stuff. And that was just so much fun. And she was very generous with her time. So she gave me tours, and I asked her about the business, stuff like how much flour do you buy? And they keep all of their ingredients in a freezer because the time it takes ingredients rise is very important for bakers and when they schedule their baking and blah, blah, blah. So they need to start with ingredients that are all at the same temperature. How do you do that? You store every single thing in a freezer. I mean, I would have never known that. So that was a very fun way to research that book.
Oh yeah, the best kind of research is the kind you can like eat, right?
Exactly. I'm still working off the pounds from those chocolate croissants.
Well, I realized that we have not had a call to action at the end of our podcasts, which for authors is, like a cardinal sin here. So, listeners or watchers, if you're watching on YouTube, please like, subscribe, leave a rating review because those are the lifeblood of podcasts and helps other people to find it and listen because the algorithms really pay attention to those things. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode and we look forward to sharing the next one with you as well.
Yep. Bye, everybody.